Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, Naomi Oreskes, who's the professor in the history of science and affiliated professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard University. She received the Young Investigator Award from the National Science Foundation, served as a consultant to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and was a consultant to the U.S. Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board. She's the co-author with Eric Conway of Merchants of Doubt: How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming, and The Collapse of Western Civilization: A View from the Future. And the latest book is Why Trust Science. And she has an op-ed at CNN, America's Devastating Divorce from Science. Welcome to Background Briefing, Naomi Oreskes.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
And we saw the most extraordinary example of anti-science, science denial, global warming denial, denial of facts, truth, just pulling it out of thin air when an official in the state of California yesterday at a meeting in Sacramento between President Trump and Governor Newsom basically said the temperatures are unbelievable, record temperatures in Death Valley, and global warming is behind these massive fires burning across the West. And then Trump said, it'll get cool soon. Wait and see. Just wait. And then the official said, but that's not what science says. And Trump more or less said, screw science. I can't remember exactly what he said. I'd never seen anything quite that blunt and hostile. Have you?
Well, that's a good question. We've seen an awful lot of things like that. There is a kind of belligerence and hostility in the current administration that does transcend the things we've seen before. So I'd say in terms of the content of the dismissal and disparagement of science, it's not really new. In terms of the tone and the attitude, yes, takes it to yet a deeper, lower level of despair.
But do you have to put this in the broader context of faith over fact, that the people in his faith, and particularly the Christian right, which is a big part of his faith, they operate on faith, not necessarily fact. And then his followers who just love to hear what they love to hear, that COVID-19 has gone away, everything is great. Is that what's happened? I don't know what kind of an infection rate it is in the consciousness of this country, but it's got to be around 30%.
Yes, it is. It's around 25 to 30% of Americans who reject scientific evidence on important issues like evolutionary biology, climate change, COVID-19, and the benefits of wearing masks. So we know that we are grappling with a significant minority. It's not the majority of the American people, so we can take a little comfort in that. It's not even close to a majority. I mean, it is actually a relatively modest slice, about a third or less, but it's a slice that's powerful and effective and important in part because of the asymmetries of our electoral system, and in part because of the efficacy of our current president in mobilizing what I like to call belligerent ignorance. But I think the bigger answer to your question is, as a historian, it's my job to put things into context. That's what I do. But the context I would put it in is not really a faith context, unless the faith you're talking about is the free market fundamentalism. What we've seen for the past 20 years or more is a rejection of scientific evidence that points out the failures of competitive capitalism. And this is the pattern that Eric Conway and I documented in Merchants of Doubt. It's the pattern we talk about in The Collapse of Western Civilization. It's the pattern that we're working on in our new book, The History of the Ideology of the Magic of the Marketplace. Conservatives in this country, Republicans, business leaders of a certain stripe, have consistently refused to accept scientific evidence that points out market failure, that points to places where we need the government to do something. We can argue about what that something is. We can argue about emissions trading or carbon taxes or regulation or command and control, but we need to do something because the market doesn't do it on its own. In fact, the opposite. The market creates these problems through economic activity, but it doesn't really have a way to fix it, at least not on its own. And this is something that Republicans, going back to Ronald Reagan, have refused to accept. Now, Ronald Reagan was a kind of good-natured guy, so what he didn't feel so horrible to most people. Over the last 40 years, the hostility has become more and more belligerent, more and more aggressive. And as I said in my piece that was published today, as the science has got stronger, the belligerence has also got strong in response. So the more the scientific evidence builds up, the more we see certain people doing everything they can to deny it. And then what we see now, the new piece with Donald Trump, is then infusing it with this sort of hostility towards educated people, hostility towards scientists. And so, again, this is something I said in my piece today, really a kind of despising of scientists and intellectuals, dismissing them as elite or elitists. And, you know, it's kind of one of the tragedies of our time. The word elite used to be a compliment, right? To be an elite athlete is a good thing. To be elite is to be at a high level, something we should respect. But Trump and his cohorts group have turned it into a term of disparagement.
I think I should have said, instead of faith over fact, belief over fact. But still, when you talk about the work that you're doing on the market, does that mean that people simply can erase history like they can erase the 1929 crash and the 2008 crash?
Well, yes, exactly. And that's a big part of actually what Eric and I are writing about right now, that one of the biggest, major, most important developments in the 20th century was the New Deal and the reforms that were put in place to capitalism, to labor practices, to finance and banking in response to the Great Depression, the largest economic calamity that had ever faced the United States and Western Europe and really the world. And, you know, what the Great Depression told us was that there were certain structural problems in the system that had to be addressed if we weren't going to have a complete economic collapse and see a quarter of the workforce displaced out of work. And so remedies were put in place. Now, were those remedies all perfect? No, of course not. They never are. But a lot of those remedies did work pretty well. And for a long time, through the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s, both Republicans and Democrats agreed on the need for certain kinds of market regulations, workplace safety, occupational health, minimum wage, maximum hours, unemployment insurance, Social Security. There was a broad American consensus on these issues, but that began to break down in the 1970s. And then from the 1980s onward, we saw the sort of rise of an ideology, an anti-government ideology, which really threw away all the lessons of the Great Depression. And in this case, it wasn't just Republicans, it was Democrats too. The more I researched, the less impressed I am by Bill Clinton, because a lot of the regulations that were put in place during the New Deal were actually undone in the Clinton administration. So there was a kind of amnesia, kind of forgetting of the lessons of history, and a kind of new faith. So I think in this case, the word faith is appropriate, faith in the markets to solve our problems. And now here we are again, where once again we have a major, serious crisis, although in this case, the crisis isn't so much an economic crisis, although there is obviously an economic component, but it's actually a scientific crisis. It's a crisis of the climate, and it's the crisis of COVID-19. And now what we see clearly is that if we don't address these scientific issues, then the economy suffers as well. And so now we're seeing the economy is, you know, a mess because we didn't deal properly with COVID-19, and we're seeing billions of dollars in damages in the American West from the wildfires.
Again, I'm speaking with Naomi Oreskes, who's a professor of history of science and affiliated professor of earth and planetary sciences at Harvard University. She received the Young Investigator Award from the National Science Foundation, served as a consultant to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and was a consultant to the U.S. Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board. And she's the co-author with Eric Conway of Merchants of Doubt, How a Handful of Scientists Obscure the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming. And her latest book is Why Trust Science? And she has an op-ed at CNN, America's Devastating Divorce from Science. So your piece starts out with Vannevar Bush, who led the U.S.'s scientific mobilization during World War II and laid a blueprint. And of course, 75 years later, it's all sort of hasn't all gone away, but, you know, the National Science Foundation, NASA, the U.S. Geological Survey, and NOAA, some of the achievements here, and it's been a bipartisan effort for decades for both Republicans and Democrats to support science. But now, of course, you've got Trump really upping the ante in his pattern of putting the fox in charge of the hen house, or putting Dracula in charge of the blood bank, with this character that he's placed at NOAA, which is all about our weather. So he's put a global warming denier in there. And again, that feels like really an insult. It's really in your face.
It is. It's extremely in your face. And so I was invited by CNN yesterday afternoon to write something about it. And I found myself feeling like, well, what more is there to say? This just keeps happening over and over and over again. And every time it happens, scientists get outraged and scientists say how terrible this is and how it doesn't serve the interests of the American people to deny science. And so I started thinking, another day, another outrage. So what do we do in the face of this constant barrage of outrages? And so I tried to step back from the immediate issue of, as you said, Dracula in the blood bank. I love that image. That's a much more potent image than the fox in the hen house, because these people are, really sucking our blood, sucking us dry. So I started thinking about, well, why has all this happened? And why do the American people seemingly not care, right? Because when something like this happens, the scientific community gets up in arms, protests, speaks up, speaks to the media, but the average American person is not reacting to this. People are not taking to the streets to protest climate change deniers' imposition of power and authority in American government. And I think part of the reason, it's obviously is a very complex issue, but I think part of the reason is that the social contract between science and the American people has broken down. And that's what I tried to bring up in this piece, to say that there was an idea encapsulated by Vannevar Bush in his report, Science, the Endless Frontier, which was that America, the American people, through our tax dollars, would support science, and in exchange, science would support us. Science would give us medicine, science would give us a better understanding of natural hazards like earthquakes and volcanoes. Science would give us better technology, the rise of computer science, computational power, the laptops that so many of us now have on our desks and cell phones, that we would benefit from supporting science. And there was broad agreement about this, broad consensus and broad support for this vision for, quite a while, for the better part of, about almost 50 years. But that social contract has clearly broken down. Many American people don't believe in the results of science, don't accept the results of science, and others, maybe they do, but they don't necessarily look to scientists for leadership, and they don't realize or understand why it is so terrible that a climate change denier could be put into a high-level position at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And so what I wanted to highlight in this piece was that scientists are still operating as if this is business as usual, as if we just keep defending science, somehow it'll get sorted out. And I think it's deeper than that. I think this is telling us that we really need a new story, a new narrative, a new vision about what the relationship of science is to the American people. And I don't know what that new vision is. It's rare for me to write a piece in which I end by saying, I don't know what the answer here is, but I know we need to do something because what we've been doing isn't working.
Well, clearly the thread seems to me to be, Naomi Oreskes, is propaganda, whether it's the propaganda from Fox News that keeps that 30% inside the bubble of delusion where they're immune to facts and information. And it's corporate propaganda, for example, that said smoking is okay, and it's corporate propaganda from the Koch brothers and others that global warming is a hoax. So aren't we up against big money here? It's that simple, isn't it? And that mendacious?
Well, I think what you said is true, but I'm not sure if it's that simple. So absolutely, corporate propaganda is a huge part of the story. And this was one of the things that Eric Conway and I wrote about Emergence of Doubt, the way the fossil fuel industry, following the model that had been established by the tobacco industry, propagandized the American people to think that we didn't really know if climate change was happening, or we didn't really know if it would be damaging, or even today that as if we don't really know that it's causing wildfires when in fact we do, just as the tobacco industry before them had cast doubt on the science linking smoking to cancer and other diseases. So corporate propaganda and the dark money behind it is a huge part of this story. We've been sold a bill of goods, and many of us are, as a result, confused, which was exactly the point of it, to confuse us. But I also think there's another component, which is, I guess, what we could call a values component, that if we look at public opinion polls, we ask people, what are the most important issues that they vote on? almost no one will say that they would vote for a candidate who makes a high priority to support American science. I mean, only scientists would say yes to that pretty much, and a few other, maybe some of the people who read my column in Scientific American, but it's just not a high value for most Americans. And I think that's in part because a lot of Americans don't actually understand why science matters to them. They don't understand or see what the added value is in their lives. Now, COVID-19 has given us an opportunity to address that. And I think the scientific community has done a pretty good job in this case. I think Anthony Fauci has been quite amazing. But I think we have to do a lot more and to really explain to the American people, here's what science does for you. So if you think about the old John F. Kennedy line about ask not what your country can do for you, the American people have the right to ask, well, what does science do for me? And I think scientists need to do more to answer that question. So not just to give people facts and good information, that's really important. We absolutely do need good information. But in addition, we need to know, how does this information matter to me? How does it affect my life? And we do have the opportunity to do this now, because with these wildfires and the smoke and Hurricane Sally and all of these things, there is a terrific opportunity here to explain to the American people how science matters to their lives, their livelihoods, the safety of their communities. And I think some scientists have done that. We certainly have some scientists who've been quite heroic in doing that, but I think we need to do much, much more.
Well, just in the last minute, is this a one-sided war, though, where the anti-intellectuals and anti-science people have declared war on knowledge and fact? And I have a friend who's won the Nobel Prize quite recently, and he's kind of angry at Fauci and all of those scientists that have been involved with this administration. He feels that they should have all en masse quit a long time ago and started a resistance movement. Yeah. Are scientists capable of becoming kind of guerrillas, activists? Because maybe that's what we need. We need toughness has to fight the lack of reason.
Well, that's a great question. And I'd love to have you invite me back to have this conversation with your Nobel laureate friend, because I think it's a really, really big question. And I've thought a lot about how, the choices that Anthony Fauci has made. I think I understand what he's doing. He feels that he can do good in that role, and he wants to do the good that he's able to do. So I don't criticize him for that. But I also sympathize with the argument that there comes a point in which you simply have to draw a line in the sand and say, no, this isn't acceptable. And how we figure that out, I think, is a very, very tricky issue. I would say, though, it is a David and Goliath kind of story, because so much of the money is on the other side. But we do have one really important thing on our side, and that is that we have the truth.
Well, Naomi Oreskes, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
You're welcome. It's always a pleasure speaking with you.
Well, thank you. And again, I've been speaking with Naomi Oreskes, who's Professor of History of Science and Affiliated Professor of Earth and Planetary Science at Harvard University. She received the Young Investigator Award from the National Science Foundation, served as a consultant to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and was a consultant to the United States Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board, and is the co-author with Eric Conway of Merchants of Doubt, How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming. And her latest book is Why Trust Science, and she has an op-ed at CNN, America's Devastating Divorce from Science. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking into how we can end the misguided policy of fire suppression and learn from the good fires of indigenous people.